Officer Bradley's cold, sharp voice echoed through the courthouse hallway as he dragged Sarah Collins toward a small courtroom. "Obstruction of a police investigation," he growled, rattling off one baseless accusation after another. A group of onlookers stood in stunned silence, murmuring to one another about how Bradley had once again overstepped his authority, driven by his all-too-familiar prejudices. Sarah's wrists, painfully restrained, bore the marks of his grip, but her defiant gaze met the crowd head-on. Despite her predicament, her eyes radiated an unshakable strength, silently promising she would not bow to injustice. The atmosphere was thick with tension, as if the building itself sensed that a pivotal truth was about to come to light. Even Officer Bradley didn't foresee how this confrontation would irrevocably change his life. That morning, Sarah had been on her way to the courthouse under the scorching summer sun. The oppressive heat weighed down on everything, but she walked with the calm focus of someone accustomed to bearing heavy burdens. Sarah had just stepped out of the grocery store after delivering homemade food to a sick friend. Holding an empty dish in her hand, she suddenly heard a worried voice coming from the nearby parking lot. An elderly man stood there, his face filled with distress as he rummaged through his pockets and bent down to look under parked cars. "I can't find it," he muttered, his voice trembling with frustration. He glanced around helplessly, as if unsure what to do. Instinctively, Sarah approached him, her sense of compassion stirring. "What have you lost?" she asked, her voice gentle and full of concern. "My wallet," he admitted, shaking his head in dismay. "I had it just a moment ago, but now it's gone." Sarah noticed his trembling hands and immediately knew she had to help. She knelt on the blistering asphalt, scanning the ground carefully. Before long, she spotted an old leather wallet partially hidden beneath a discarded newspaper. Picking it up, she handed it back to the man, and the relief on his face was instantaneous. "Thank you," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "You're an angel." Sarah smiled warmly. "Anyone would have done the same," she replied. But deep down, she knew that wasn't entirely true. Sarah's parents had taught her from a young age to always act with kindness, no matter the circumstances. Even when the world wasn't kind in return, they believed that small acts of kindness were the threads that wove communities together. This lesson had stayed with Sarah for decades. With her good deed behind her, she continued on her way to the courthouse. The imposing building loomed ahead, its towering columns and wide stone steps standing stark against the cloudless blue sky. Built to symbolize justice, the structure instead filled Sarah with unease. Over the years, she had come to see justice as an uphill battle, especially for those like her who belonged to a minority. At 53, Sarah had endured her share of life's hardships, each one contributing to her quiet resilience. As she approached the courthouse steps, she noticed a commotion near the entrance. A tall, broad-shouldered police officer with a bald head and a name tag that read Bradley was intimidating a young black boy. The boy, no older than 10, clutched his backpack tightly to his chest as if it were a shield, his wide eyes filled with panic under Bradley's piercing glare. "Loitering," the officer barked. "This isn't a place for you to hang around. This is public property," the boy stammered. A weak reply, his voice barely audible. Sarah's steps slowed. She recognized the fear in the boy's hunched posture, the way his shoulders braced as if expecting the worst. A wave of unease washed over her, and she clenched her fists. Moving forward, she spoke with a calm but firm voice. "Is there a problem here?" Officer Bradley turned, his sharp eyes narrowing as he sized up the interruption. "Stay out of this, lady," he snapped. "This doesn't concern you." Sarah held his gaze without blinking, her composure unwavering. "The boy hasn't done anything wrong," she said firmly. "This is a public building. He has every right to be here." Bradley's lips curled into a mocking sneer. "People like you," he muttered, his tone dripping with disdain, "always sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." A familiar pang rose in Sarah's chest. She had heard those words before, always spoken with the same dismissive tone, but she refused to let it rattle her calm. "He's just a child," Sarah replied steadily. "Let him go." Bradley hesitated for a moment, his grip on the boy's backpack loosening just enough for the boy to break free. Without looking back, the boy darted into the crowd of onlookers, disappearing before Bradley could react. Furious, Bradley spun around to face Sarah, his face flushed with anger. "You want to get involved? Fine," he roared, grabbing Sarah's arm with a vice-like grip. "You can explain yourself inside." A murmur spread through the crowd. Some onlookers gaped in shock at his sudden aggression, while others booed in protest, and a few were too stunned to speak. Sarah's heart raced, but she kept her composure, her voice steady. "I have nothing to hide," she replied calmly. Bradley dragged her into the courthouse, leaving the murmuring crowd behind. His heavy footsteps echoed against the marble floors. The cool air inside did nothing to alleviate the oppressive tension, which was only heightened by the curious stares of bystanders as they passed. A few people whispered to one another, clearly recognizing Bradley and his less-than-stellar reputation. Sarah was brought into a small courtroom where the air felt stiflingly heavy. Though the room wasn't crowded, all eyes seemed to focus on her. Bradley wasted no time rattling off a string of accusations: obstruction, disturbing the peace, and even an absurd claim of assaulting and resisting an officer. Each charge grew increasingly ridiculous. Yet Sarah maintained a calm, inscrutable expression. The court clerk, a sharp-eyed woman with a stern demeanor, occasionally glanced at Sarah with a hint of sympathy as she recorded Bradley's accusations. Meanwhile, Bradley stood tall, his voice laced with smugness and contempt. It was clear he was reveling in the moment, savoring the power he believed he wielded. Sarah observed him silently, her resolve unshaken. The sound of the judge entering the courtroom broke the tension. Judge Avery, a man with a piercing gaze and a commanding presence, took his seat at the bench. He looked down at Bradley, then at Sarah, and frowned. It was evident that the judge sensed something was off about the officer's story, but protocol required him to proceed with caution. "Officer Bradley," he began in a measured tone, "please explain why Ms. Collins is being considered a threat." Bradley immediately launched into an elaborate tale, portraying Sarah as a disruptive troublemaker who had interfered with his duties. The story was so exaggerated that Sarah almost smiled, but she held her composure, her gaze scanning the faces in the room. Some onlookers appeared outraged, while others seemed skeptical. Yet no one spoke up. Perhaps they were accustomed to watching people like Bradley overpower the vulnerable within these very walls. Suddenly, the heavy doors at the back of the room swung open. A court clerk entered, carrying a thin file and looking visibly uneasy. He approached the bench and whispered something to Judge Avery, who listened intently. The judge's brow furrowed even deeper, and he lightly tapped his gavel. "We will take a brief recess," he announced. "The hearing will resume in 15 minutes. A buzz of murmurs spread throughout the room as the onlookers speculated about the new information that had just come to light. Sarah sat silently, her hands resting neatly on her lap, while Bradley paced near the prosecution table, his arms crossed defiantly, clearly confident in his victory. When the hearing resumed, the tension in the room was palpable. Judge Avery fixed Bradley with a cold stare before turning to Sarah. "Miss Collins," he said, "you may speak." Sarah straightened her posture, her voice calm yet resolute. "Your Honor," she began, "there has been a misunderstanding. I intervened only to protect a child from unwarranted harassment, not to obstruct justice. My entire life has been dedicated to upholding the law, not breaking it." As she spoke, Sarah reached into her pocket and retrieved a small leather case. With a steady hand, she opened it, revealing a golden badge. A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom, astonishment evident on everyone's faces. "I am the federal prosecutor for this district and several others," Sarah declared firmly. "My duties include overseeing civil rights cases, including allegations of abuse of power. That boy committed no crime." Officer Bradley's actions were not only unprofessional but deeply troubling. Bradley's face turned pale, as if her words had drained the confidence from him. His mouth opened as though to protest, but no words came out. Judge Avery's expression hardened as he reviewed the documents the court clerk had brought. "Officer Bradley," the judge began, his tone stern and commanding. Your conduct raises serious concerns. This court cannot and will not tolerate abuses of power, especially in a place where justice must prevail above all else. I am ordering an immediate investigation into your actions. Ms. Collins, the judge continued, all charges against you are dismissed, and this court offers its sincerest apologies to you. The room filled with quiet yet meaningful applause. Bradley's shoulders slumped, his earlier arrogance dissolving as he grasped the gravity of the situation. A security officer approached and escorted him out of the courtroom, a fitting reckoning awaiting him and his failure now plainly evident to all. Sarah stepped outside the courthouse, casting one last glance back without saying a word. Within her, a fierce determination burned brighter than ever. She descended the stone steps with a calm and dignified air. A few people approached her, expressing their gratitude and admiration. Among them was the young boy she had defended, standing at a distance with eyes full of reverence. Sarah gave him a small nod, a silent affirmation that courage and kindness still held great value. The afternoon sun remained as scorching as before, but the atmosphere seemed lighter, as if the shadow of injustice had been momentarily lifted. Sarah clenched her fists and continued down the sidewalk, her resolve shining brighter than ever. This victory was but a small battle, yet she knew greater challenges lay ahead, and she was ready to face them and bring them into the light. Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoyed this story. If you did, don't hesitate to like and share the video with your friends. Be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming stories. Have a wonderful day.